I was born in the Dominican Republic, and we came here in the 40s, my mother and my brother and I. We came here in a way primarily because my brother had some challenges, and we were hoping that we could seek medical attention. Um, I mean, that ended up being sort of not, it didn't happen for a long, long time before we finally were able to have some medication that improved his petit mal seizures and some other problems that he had. But that was, in a way, the primary reason why we came. Mm-hmm. And my, you know, my background of the Dominican Republic that I grew up in, I had half of my cousins were Italian Dominicans because there was a huge Italian immigration, mostly of men who married local women. And so it was a culture that I was very familiar with. I remember how much fun it was to be invited to go over to dinner at those houses because it was always an Italian feast. And it's interesting because that experience, in a way, played a role in us adjusting once we got to New York, because when we came, there were not that many Hispanics. And there was, though, a large Italian population, and my mother, who ended up working in a factory, those are the people that she interacted with. And because the culture was familiar, I assume, we ended up being invited to their homes on Sunday. And so it's interesting to me, looking back in retrospect, to see that connection. And eventually, of course, Spanish people started to arrive, and then the whole thing just changed completely. But eventually, and many years later, because of course I'm now working days and going to school at night, I do get my degree in 1964. And the following year, I end up back here in Boston for the first time. I had lived in Chicago. By this time, I'm remarried, mm-hmm. And my then husband is accepted to Harvard, and we come here. And then again, this is another experience of 2 months of job hunting in Boston in 1965. And, you know, Boston isn't what it is today. This was a very, very unfriendly place. And I end up, luckily, as it turns out, although I was miserable, at the Grove Hall Welfare Department, where eventually they have the riots. And it was a very depressing experience because it was a very depressing place to work. The job at the welfare department is what links me up to Roxbury Multi-Service Center, because that's the place I really wanted to work in. And they wouldn't hire me because I didn't have an MSW. But while I was working at welfare, I would share cases. I was constantly, any excuse to be in the building and interacting. So by the time I reapply, I'm a known quantity. I'm somebody that's familiar, and I do get hired. Mm. And Hubie Jones becomes my mentor, mm-hmm. and also gives me the assignment of trying to find out what's happening in the Hispanic community, because he's concerned, having grown up in Harlem, he didn't want to see a repetition of the tensions that existed in Harlem between Hispanics and Blacks. And he wants to see if that could be avoided. And so one of my assignments is to see what exists. And I visit every single Spanish agency, there are about a handful, and discovered and come back and report that ETC, now EBA, is the strongest one, but they're in the South End.
Emergency tenancy.
Right. And there is this fledgling group that calls itself Alianza Hispana. And they picked that name because the other existing agency, the Association of Protection of Puerto Rican Rights, something like APROS was the acronym, they wanted to pick something that was more encompassing and not picking one particular group. And in part too, because in Dorchester, you also had Dominicans as well as Puerto Ricans, and longtime Cubans too. I mean, it just was a different population. And so this group, which has started by two teachers in the Winthrop School, as you mentioned in your book, who are concerned about kids coming to class hungry, not clothes properly for the winter, begin to organize. But they don't. What I bring to the table is that I'm familiar with model cities which exist, and I see that this is the opening. They're in model cities area, but model cities wasn't serving the Hispanic population, and we could document that. So I write a proposal. It was $1 million proposal, and we go before the city council. And what you don't know, I didn't know how much the city council, which was Irish dominated,
Mhm.
resented that the model cities and all these resources going to the Black community. So in a way, it was to my advantage because they saw me as a tool to get back to and criticize a pro. But you don't know that. I mean, this is me in retrospect analyzing. But I go before them, and we reach Senator Kennedy. We do press all the right buttons, and eventually we're sent out of the room because they say, "But we can't give you $1 million. Come back with a more reasonable number of you can spend in a year." And in that meeting, when we go off to have the meeting, Hubie Jones again plays a critical role. The meeting is with Paul Parks, who's the head of Model Cities. And Paul Parks says to us, "I can't give you any money. The Black community is going to be in uproar." And Hubie Jones says, "What Black community?" Because Hubie Jones is in the room. And so, I mean, it's these little moments that, are very important of just having the right. And so we're giving, I would think it was 500,000, and we open up the first storefront and order books. And obviously 500,000, it's a lot of money to spend in 1 year also. And by the time that we also get designated the former police station on the corner of Dudley and Blue Hill Avenue, but by the time they move in there, I'm gone. One other thing that I should mention about this is Kevin White is the mayor, and Kevin once said to me that a piece of him identified with the Puerto Rican community and saw them as maybe like had the Irish had been, and so he was a little bit more receptive, leaned a little bit more toward helping because he began making appointments when we really hadn't proved our votes or our support, but it was there, and he was obviously very supportive of Alianza.
Once you got the grant and set up the storefront, what exactly were you doing? What kind of services were you providing? What were the priorities?
Thank you. The priority, literacy has always been very important to me. By the way, I used to tutor literacy also when I was on 111th Street. And I did that in the Dominican Republic. And so literacy was important. And I remember we ended up getting funding from the Department of Education for mothers tutoring mothers. It was the first program. We were doing this in people's houses and using other Spanish-speaking people to tutor illiterate mothers. And it was a powerful program, but of course didn't last very long. So literacy, working skills, I mean, it was a multi-service agency. But those were the emphasis. Housing was not as big an issue. The same thing happened when Roxbury Multi-Service Center got founded. Housing was not an issue, and it soon became an issue because, again, it's gentrification and the changes that were happening. So they changed, and Alianza eventually developed Dudley Initiative, which focused on housing. But when I leave it, it's a multi-service center with the emphasis on mothers and children, as I remember, and youth and those kinds of programs. It was a natural for me to work closely in the Black community and identify with the Black community because I come from an island that I consider a Black island. I mean, of the 3 islands, we have the most, I mean, we are the Blackest, if I can use that term. because of who has invaded, who has, and our relationship with Haiti. I mean, that's who we got our independence from, and the movement of people is constant, and that's just part of our history. And so it was a natural for me, I think, to move in that direction and feel comfortable and see them as supportive rather than as people that I needed to fight with.